I was so glad to hear that Dr. Blackaby has read my book. He's one of the elect few who've done so. So that is certainly a thrill. Let me get this set up here real quick. Yes, you can see it. As you can see, we are going to talk about Cain and Abel tonight. A word about the book. My lectures arise from the book, but they are not material that is in the book. So this is going to be supplemental material for those of you who have read the book, the students who are taking this for credit who've read the book. So this is not going to be a repetitive of what you've already read. It's going to be kind of additional material. The basic idea of the problem of the Old Testament is that Christian readers do have a hard time knowing what to do with the Old Testament. Many of the messianic prophecies are difficult to unravel. It's hard to know what to do with the law because Paul seems to speak pretty negatively about the law. It's hard to even know what precisely the function of much of the Old Testament is. And this book is an attempt to show how the Old Testament belongs to us, how it truly is for us, how even the law teaches and instructs us, how messianic prophecy works, and so forth and so on. So that's what the book is all about. But as I say, these are additional lectures that I hope will be of value to you. Now, it's always a horror of any lecturer, for people to start to fall asleep in the middle of his lecture. Let me just say, if anyone has a right to fall asleep in here, it's me. I flew up here today, had a 6 a.m. flight, which meant I had to get up at 3 a.m., which your time was what? No, it's 2 hours difference, 1 a.m. So I've been up basically since 1 a.m. So I'm a little punchy right now, but I'll try to get through it. And hopefully, if I can stay awake through this lecture, you can. All right. We're going to talk about Genesis chapter 4, Cain and Abel, but we're going to do it to get a window into how to interpret the Old Testament and how not to interpret the Old Testament. And this applies to the Bible generally. There are a lot of fallacies that people apply when they are reading and interpreting the Bible. This lecture will not cover all of them, but it's going to cover some that I think often go unnoticed. And then I'm going to talk to you about what I think the chapter really has to teach us. And in fact, it is a very, very interesting and I think important chapter. So let's begin by considering some interpretive fallacies in interpreting Genesis 4. So let's read the passage first of all. Now the man had sexual relations with Eve, his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With Yahweh's help, I've made a man." And then she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel was a shepherd of sheep, but Cain was a farmer, a worker of soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruit of the soil as an offering to Yahweh, and Abel brought as an offering as well some of the firstborn of his sheep with the fatty portions of the meat taken from them. And Yahweh looked favorably upon Abel and his offspring, but he did not look favorably upon Cain and his offspring. And this angered Cain a great deal, and his face was troubled. And Yahweh said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why is your face troubled? If you do what is right, won't you be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, then sin lurks at the door. His desire is for you, but you must rule him." And Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go into the field." And while they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and murdered him. And Yahweh said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" And he replied, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And Yahweh said, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's shed blood cries out to me from the soil. And now You are cursed because of the soil that opened its mouth to receive the shed blood of your brother from your hand. Although you may work the soil, it will not give its production to you. You will be a vagabond and a wanderer on the land." And Cain said to Yahweh, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. You have driven me today from the soil, and I am hidden from you, and I will be a vagabond and a wanderer on the land, and whoever finds me will kill me." And Yahweh said to him, "As for that, anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times worse." And Yahweh set a mark on Cain, so that no one who found him would kill him. And Cain departed from Yahweh and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And Cain had sexual relations with his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. And Cain was a city builder, and he called the name of the city after his son's name, Enoch. And Irad was born to Enoch, and Irad fathered Mehujael, and Mehujael fathered Methushael, and Methushael fathered Lamech. And Lamech took 2 wives. The name of one was Adah, and the name of the other was Zillah. Adah gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live among tents and livestock. The name of his brother was Jubal. He was the father of all who play stringed instruments and pipes. And Zillah also gave birth. Her son was Tubal-Cain, a man who worked with all kinds of tools of bronze and iron. Naamah was Tubal-Cain's sister. And Lamech said to his wives, "Adah and Zillah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, pay attention to my words. I killed a man for harming me, and a boy for striking me. If Cain will be avenged 7-fold, then Lamech will be avenged 77-fold." So, that is chapter 4 of the book of Genesis. What are some common approaches that are taken as people read this chapter, seek to interpret it, seek to teach it, seek to preach it, seek to incorporate it into their Christian thinking? Well, one approach is a focal verse approach, where you simply zero in on the passage or the single verse that really stands out to you. You read a passage and something just jumps out and grabs your attention, and you make that the entire focus of your interpretation. So in this case, you find something that can serve as a moral lesson and focus on that. A lot of people will read this chapter and focus on, am I my brother's keeper? Now, I have a very clear memory of this specific thing because of my dear mother. I remember one time when I was, about 8 or 9 years old. My mother was a preacher's kid. She was, her father was a Methodist preacher in rural Texas, itinerant circuit riding preacher. And one day she said to me, "Where's your brother?" And I said, "Well, I don't know where he is. Am I supposed to take care of my brother?" And she said, "Yes, you are your brother's keeper." And I thought, what is she talking about? I was mortified. But anyway, that has always stuck with me. But the point is, people will read this, they'll read the entire chapter, see all that stuff about what goes on. They'll see this one verse, and they say, boy, that is terrific. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, yes, you are your brother's keeper. And that becomes the entire interpretation of the text for that reader. Now, in the passage, God does not, in fact, respond to, am I my brother's keeper? He doesn't say, well, yes, as a matter of fact, you are. The narrative does not develop that idea. There's nothing more said about that in the rest of the passage. Now, that's not to say that the insight is wrong. It's a valid insight that we are supposed to be our brother's keeper. Obviously, Cain used it as an excuse to try to say, well, how should I know where my brother is? When, of course, he killed him. But that is not the entire purpose of Genesis chapter 4, just to encourage us to be our brother's keeper. Again, it is valid, but we shouldn't make that one verse the lesson of the entire chapter, because as I hope we will see, there's a lot more to it than that. Another common approach is to look for hidden meanings. Look for something in the passage that the average reader would never see, but that you as an interpreter want to claim is somehow the key to the whole thing. So you can look for hidden meaning in names or in numbers. For example, the name Cain in Hebrew is Cain, and it sounds like I have made Qanithi, which of course is what Eve said when she gives birth to a son. And it is a word play in Hebrew. Hebrew does this all the time. Hebrew loves to have words that sound the same and make a little play with them. Sometimes in certain passages, those can be very important. In other passages, they're just little literary devices or little historical notes. They're not really conveying the message of the entire passage. Word plays in names are rarely the point of the text in which they occur. In Genesis 4, nothing is said about the names. Genesis 4 doesn't develop the meaning of the names. The narrative doesn't go into it. It's not concerned with it. The Bible, as you can see here, is not filled with Easter eggs. What do I mean by that? Well, of course, that's an old computer kind of term, and it refers to a program that has some little surprise in it, that if you know the exact correct little series of keystrokes or something, there'll be a little burst of fireworks on the screen or something like that. That's an Easter egg. And some people want to make the Bible into a book of hidden, secret bursts of fireworks, little brilliant things that just show up if you know the hidden code. And that is not what the Bible is for. That is not what the Bible is about. It is not a book written in a secret code that if you know some kind of secrets about the Hebrew language, or you know something about how to calculate the numbers, that you'll come up with some secret, hidden, super duper message. That is not what the Bible is doing, and that's not what we should do with Genesis 4. Now, a much more common approach with something like Genesis 4 is filling in the gaps. And by filling in the gaps, I mean there are things the Bible doesn't tell us, and we try to fill in the gap. We try to provide the information that the Bible does not provide. We try to come up with answers that the Bible not only does not answer, but is not even concerned about, doesn't even talk about. So this is not so much a method of interpretation as it is a distraction. That is to say, when you read the Bible, if the main thing you are seeing is unanswered questions, where you're wondering why the Bible didn't give you this little bit of information, and you try to fill it in, instead of focusing what is written in the text, you're focusing on what the author of the text wasn't that concerned about. You're focusing on something that the author didn't think worth providing. And so that, I think, is a real distraction in interpretation. We can ask the wrong questions trying to get information that is simply not provided. What really becomes problematic is often our whole interpretation will then be based on our expanded version. In other words, somebody will read a passage of the Bible. There'll be some bit of information that guy wants to know, but the Bible doesn't tell him. He decides what he thinks the missing information is. He provides it. And then from that point forward, his entire interpretation is essentially an expansion of what he himself has provided. And so that is, I think, not the way to go about interpreting the Bible. We ought to consider the implications and significance of what the text actually says. I don't know if you've noticed this before, but first of all, the Old Testament, though it looks really big, it's really a very small book, especially when you consider like giving the entire history of Israel, going from the conquest under Joshua until the destruction of Jerusalem in the course of 40 chapters, 50 chapters, whatever it is. It's a very, very brief, abbreviated, short telling of the story. And the Bible leaves out a lot of details. Not only that, some of the tales that it does give, it repeats over and over again. And so it's not just that it doesn't take up a lot of space. The space that it often uses with repetition. Obviously, because the author thought this is really important. They really need to hear this. So the lesson here is, and we'll explore it further, examine what the text actually says, not what it does not say. So what are the gaps in biblical narrative? Biblical narrative, as I just said, is generally sparse, skipping information that a modern writer might consider vital. All kinds of information that for a modern historian or a storyteller, a writer, that we would consider absolutely essential, a biblical writer will just completely leave out if it is not the point he's trying to make. Genesis 4 illustrates one basic principle of biblical interpretation. Do not fill in missing information. Look for the significance of the details that are in the narrative. We'll examine that in more detail in a few minutes. One thing, though, I do want to talk about as an important aspect of biblical interpretation, is this is something you should do, is be aware of the presence of themes in biblical interpretation. Biblical narrative creates certain thematic ideas that persist through the whole Bible, and we'll examine some of these in Genesis 4. In other words, there will be certain concepts that will emerge early on in the Bible, and the Bible will come back to those ideas again and again and again. It will develop it in many ways. It will expand upon it. It will give different facets of it. But the Bible loves to pick certain key topics, key themes, and just in the course of its narrative and also in prophecy, just add more and more to that basic idea. Genesis is the fountainhead of many such patterns, and we're going to look at a few of them tonight as we examine Genesis 4. So, we're going to just switch to the next lecture real quick. You say, why do you have this as 2 lectures instead of just 1? Well, I'll tell you. A lot of these lectures go online because we have a lot of online courses. And online students have incredibly short attention span. And you have to keep every lecture to about 15 minutes or so, or they'll just lose interest and turn it off. So all of these lectures, they get broken up into 3 and 4 and 5 pieces. This one's just broken into 2 pieces. So now let's look at Cain and Abel and try to see some of those exegetical fallacies in action, and also try to see what I would recommend to you the text is really focusing on. First, rejection of Cain's offering. There's a lot of speculation on this. Why did God reject Cain's offering? Notice what we have there. We have a piece of information that the Bible does not give us. It doesn't say a word about why God rejected Cain's offering. Did Cain already harbor some sin? Did he already feel antagonistic towards his brother before the sacrifice? Well, maybe, but we don't know that because the Bible doesn't say that. Anything we say on this is empty speculation. Now, of course, the most common speculation will be what? Cain offered a grain offering, whereas Abel offered an animal sacrifice. And that Abel's offering was right because it was an animal and it was not grain. Well, let's consider this. First of all, the Israelites were allowed to make grain offerings. Grain offerings are not forbidden in the Bible, Leviticus chapter 2. We can take it as a given, however, that they considered sacrificed animals to be of higher value than grain offerings. And we know this for sure. Whenever a person in the Bible wants to make an important sacrifice, it's always going to be a bull or a sheep or a goat or something like that. So we know that, we understand that, but again, we need to be careful. The Bible doesn't say God rejects grain offerings, or that in this particular case, God rejected Cain's offering because it was grain. The text just doesn't say that. The important sacrifices always did involve offering animals, not just grain. That's true. But again, that is not the focus of the passage. If it were, the passage would say something like, that is why to this day the Israelites always make an animal sacrifice if it really matters, or something to that effect. But it doesn't say anything like that. Thus, even though we can say, yes, animal sacrifice is kind of the highest sacrifice in the Old Testament, that's not, in my opinion, the focus of this passage. It's not something the passage ever explicitly says or is explicitly concerned about. And as I say, grain offerings, in fact, were allowed in the Old Testament. Well, we do have in the story an account of murder and its aftermath. This, in my view, is the real story. The rejection of the grain offering only sets it up. So again, what am I trying to encourage you to do here? I'm trying to encourage you not to focus on what the text doesn't talk about. Why did God reject Cain's offering? And to focus on what it does talk about. Cain became very angry. He was bitter. His face fell, meaning he felt humiliated, and he responded with murder. That is what the passage talks about. That is the focus and message of the text to this point. Notice, the first murder was not motivated by greed, bloodlust, or spousal jealousy. It was motivated by religion. Cain did not murder his brother because he wanted to steal something from him. Cain did not murder Abel because he wanted to steal Abel's girlfriend. He didn't murder him just because, as far as we can tell in the passage, Cain was just a mean, murderous thug of a man. He murdered him because Abel's sacrifice was accepted and Cain's was rejected. It was a murder motivated by religion. What does that establish? Cain's doctrine, and again, we don't need to fill in the gap what his doctrine was. It's just Cain as a religious person. Cain as a person who offered a sacrifice to God was apostate. And in rage, he murdered righteous Abel. And this is what the New Testament focuses on. Matthew 23:35 and Luke 11:51. Cain, to put it in terms that make it very simple for us to understand, he held to a form of religion that God rejected. Abel held to a form of religion that God accepted. And in jealousy and rage, Cain murdered Abel. That makes Cain the forefather of all religious persecution. That makes him the forefather, especially of those who persecute the righteous, who persecute the church, and above all, who persecuted Jesus. Luke 11:50 and 51. Therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Now notice, be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets. Now, we don't need to concern ourselves with, well, is Abel a prophet? The important point is Abel is regarded as a righteous man. He is a man who was accepted by God. Whatever the issue was, whatever the reason was, God rejected Cain's sacrifice and accepted Abel's. Abel was the righteous one. Abel was the one who came to God correctly, properly, in the way God wanted to be approached. And he was murdered in a fit of religious rage and persecution. So the point here again is, don't focus on what the text doesn't talk about. Focus on what it does talk about. And notice this is a theme that has been followed all the way through the New Testament, and it actually goes all the way up through the book of Revelation. Revelation chapter 16, when the angels pouring out the bowls of wrath, they pour out a bowl of wrath on the rivers and the springs, and they turn to blood, and the angels cry out, "You're righteous, O God, because they have poured out the blood of your saints and your prophets, and you have given them their blood to drink." So the idea goes all the way through to the book of Revelation, the persecution of the righteous by the wicked, by those who hold to a false religion, and of course it reaches its climax in the crucifixion of Jesus. Missing people, another issue in Genesis 4. Cain claimed that whoever found him would kill him. Also, he had a wife, and he built a city. Now that's quite something. In the narrative, we know of 4 people: Adam, Eve, their firstborn son Cain, and the deceased Abel. So that cuts us down to 3 people. Now, Seth in chapter 4, verse 25 is born. And in chapter 5, verse 4, it does speak of other sons and daughters, although the narrative itself doesn't make any connection. In other words, it doesn't come back in chapter 5 and say, oh, by the way, if you're wondering how Cain got his wife, well, here's your answer. Or who in the world was he going to build this city for? You know, the point is that is something the Bible doesn't concern itself with. It tells the story. It says Cain found a wife. It says he built a city. And we are just supposed to accept it. Now, you can explore this as a matter of apologetics. That's fine. But when you are interpreting the passage, when you're trying to see what is the lesson this text here has for the church, the lesson for the church is, here, I've solved the mystery. I know where Cain got his wife. The lesson for the church is something else. And so, again, don't focus on what it doesn't focus on. Where did these people come from is the wrong question for interpretation. Again, it may be valid for apologetics, but not for interpretation. And that leads us to another wrong question, the mark of Cain. What was the mark of Cain? What did it look like? Where was it? Was it like stuck on his forehead? What was the mark of Cain? Was there anything about Cain that motivated God to spare his life? Well, again, the Bible doesn't tell us why God spared Cain's life. What did the mark look like? As I just said, where was it put? How did people know that this mark meant don't kill Cain? We don't know. I don't know. Was it like a sword with a slash drawn through it or something? We just don't know. And the Bible doesn't tell us. So as I just said, we don't know how it was recognized. We don't know why God gave it to him. None of that is answered in the narrative. However, the mark of Cain has implications for narrative content. The essential fact is this: God spared Cain and set a mark on him so it was clear to all that he had been spared. We don't know why, we just know that he did. Cain had many descendants and built a city. So again, we don't know where they all came from, but we know that he had a lot of descendants and enough people that you could call this settlement a city. What is the lesson here? What kind of is the theme that is developed and that persists through the Bible? Well, you already know because you can see the screen. It is allowing the wicked to continue. It implies that God does not quickly strike down the wicked from the earth. We would expect, if I were God and I ruled the world, here's how I would do it. And we would expect God would just swing through and just obliterate really bad people. But that's not what happens. That's not the outcome. This is a major issue in Psalms and Job. When you read the Psalms, you will frequently see how, it'll say things like, "Be not vexed because of evildoers." When they thrive, when you see their violence, when you see their crimes seemingly go unpunished. Why does it say, "Be not vexed"? Because we are vexed. And we want to know, why doesn't God punish them? And this becomes a huge issue in the book of Job, where Job will give these long speeches and he'll say, look at the world around you. You can see people who are rich and powerful. They never go hungry. They live to see their children and their grandchildren, and they thrive and they oppress people and they exploit people. And as far as I can see, Job says, God doesn't seem to do anything about it. Now, we're not here to interpret the book of Job. If you want the answer to that, then you'll need to buy my Job commentary when it comes out in a few months. So just look for it. But anyway. But the fact is, this is a major issue in the Bible. God spares the wicked for his own reasons. Like a field containing both wheat and weeds, God allows the just and the unjust to thrive together. Of course, I grew up knowing this as the parable of the wheat and the tares. Now, more literally, the wheat and the weeds. But in the parable, a man plants a field, and it turns out that an enemy has put in these seed for weeds in there, and now the field has both wheat and weeds all over the place. And his servants say, we got to go pull up these weeds. And the owner says, no, if you do that, you're just going to make a complete wreck. Just let them grow together until the proper time to separate them. But God, for his own purposes and his own reasons and his own timing, he allows both to thrive together. And we do not always see the wicked get the punishment that we feel they deserve. He sends sunshine and rain on both the good and the bad. So what do we know from Genesis 4? We don't know what the mark looked like. We don't know how people recognized it for what it was. We don't even know where all these other people came from. But we know that God spared Cain and made sure nobody killed him. God, for his own purposes and his own reasons, lets the wicked and the righteous both thrive in the world until he decides when and how to take care of it. The decadent city. Now, we've talked about the fact that, Cain built a city, and the Bible doesn't tell us who populated it, where all these people came from. All we know is he built a city. But what the Bible tells us about the city, what Genesis 4 says about the city, is actually pretty interesting, I think. Cain went from being a soil worker, in Hebrew, and loved azamah, to a city builder, in Hebrew, boneh. So that was quite a change from a life of rural agriculture, as we would think of it, a farmer, to being an urban person, a person who focuses on making a city grow and expand. Very, very different occupations and very different outlooks. Now, the Israelites appear to have recognized a kind of descending scale of human status. This is sort of popular Israelite culture. They clearly thought of the role of the shepherd as being kind of the ideal occupation. The ideal man is the shepherd who goes out with the sheep. Moses was a shepherd. Abel was a shepherd. David was a shepherd. And so this is kind of presented as this is sort of, for us Israelites anyway, this is kind of the picture of what we think of is at the heart of our culture and what we think is really the best thing for human nurture and human character and human strength, the life of the shepherd. Then below that, but above the urbanite, is the farmer, the person who works the soil. They clearly had a high regard for people who earned their bread by the sweat of their brow. The lowest level was the urbanite, the city dweller. The city is looked upon as a place of corruption. And of course, you have many examples of this. The first great example, of course, is Sodom, where the city is a place where people, even before Sodom, you have Babel and the Tower of Babel. So the city, a place of corruption, a place of power, a place where people develop a skewed ideology, developed warped morals, and so forth. And Cain is here, so to speak, the father of the city. He is the first city builder. You have the story of the Rechabites in Jeremiah 35, which is an interesting story. Jeremiah was in the city of Jerusalem, and a group of people who are kind of itinerant shepherds come by. They're the Rechabites, and he is told by God to bring some of them into the city and to the temple area and there offer them wine. And he does that, and they say, "No, we can't drink wine. We're Baptists." No, it wasn't because they were Baptists. It was because their father Rechab had taken a vow that his descendants would not drink wine, and they never drank wine. And there's actually more to it than just not drinking wine. Wine forces you, it ties you to the soil. Because, of course, even more so than grain, planting a vineyard and developing it through the years so that it yields grapes and so that then you can use it to produce grain. That is a long-term plan, and it requires years and years in one settled place. And so by not drinking wine and not tying themselves to the soil, they continue this life of itinerant shepherds moving from place to place with their sheep. And again, this is kind of presented as sort of, within the Israelite culture, it's kind of an ideal that they look upon fondly, that this is how people really should live. As I just said, Babel in Genesis 11, Sodom in Genesis 19, these become paradigms of evil and corruption that is associated with the city. You have, though, the portrait of the cultured city in the Bible. Notice in Genesis 4, this descendant of Cain, Jubal, is accredited with creating music. Now, most of us would think that's a pretty good thing to have. And of course, in the Bible, music is a good thing to have. You have all kinds of references to music, especially in the book of Psalms, and talking about musical instruments. And so clearly, singing and music was something that the Israelites were very, very fond of. They thought it was important. It was an aspect of the worship of God. And yet, it was created in this wicked city founded by Cain, by a descendant of Cain. The metalworking of Tubal-Cain. Now, this kind of basically represents the rise of technology. You know, here's someone who learns how to work with metal and to create objects that otherwise could not have been made. And it truly is a major technological advance in human society and human culture. And again, the Bible attributes this to the city and to a descendant of Cain. It is surprising that Jabal is called the father of those who live among tents and livestock, since in fact Abel is the first shepherd. However, Jabal may be a special kind of shepherd, a kind that the Israelites were very familiar with. These were not shepherds who just wandered from place to place and could, from year to year, just travel miles and miles and miles and not have any one place as their home. These were people who really stuck to a given city. They just lived kind of on the outskirts of the city. They would shepherd the sheep around that city, and they would be kind of on the edge of the urban life of that city. So it's probably a distinctive kind of shepherd. Jabal perhaps represents shepherds on the fringe of cities, sort of a counterculture. The fact that in a city you can have both very urban life, music and technology, but you can also have things that are on the fringes of rural life. And so what you have in the portrait of the city in Genesis 4 actually is not all bad. It is a place where culture is created, where technology is created, where even people who continue the old life of shepherds can kind of thrive on the edge. So even as the Bible presents the city as something founded by the first murderer, it also presents the city as something that can do some really wonderful things. Well, then we come to Lamech, the urban thug. So you remember, he's the guy who had his little poem about how he murdered a person for being rude to him. So Lamech murdered a man for some petty injuries. Maybe he physically hurt him, maybe he hit him, maybe he was just rude, we don't know. But Lamech was so offended that he killed the guy. He had 2 women, not just one, and he boasted to them of his murder in a little song. He made a little poem. He said, listen to my little song. And he sang a song about how he murdered this guy to his women. What is that? What is going on there? Well, if you think about it, it is something that has persisted to this day as part of the corruption of urban life. It anticipates, I would say, even the worst of hip-hop culture. And I just use this as an example. Don't misunderstand me. But it is the idea that what do you do to make yourself a name in the city? A, you have to have a harem. You have to have a collection of women who follow you around. B, you're violent. You can kill somebody. You're bad. C, you sing about it. You got a little song that you can chant. Tell everybody how bad you are, how nasty you are, how you can kill someone, and have these women look at you and say, wow, he is really fantastic. And if you think about it, that is, in a nutshell, the corruption of urban culture. People living together and going through this process of decay and decadence that leads to violence. It leads to a wrong view of sexuality, where a man, he makes it a goal basically to collect women, and to a perversion and an abuse of what had been created, music, turning it into something that extols violence. So, again, what do we have in the Bible? In Genesis 4, we have the founding of a city, and we have really a very complex look at what a city is. A city is the source of great culture. It is the source of technology. It can have diverse groups of people in it, going from people who work with metal and technology to people who are out there with sheep. And it also can be a place of great decadence, and where evil just kind of boils and thrives. So for him, that is for Lamech, the mark of Cain is a badge of honor. If Cain will be avenged sevenfold, Lamech will be avenged 77-fold. So he wants to say, you think Cain was tough, I'm way worse than he ever was. And for him, that's a good thing. That's something to brag about. So Genesis is the book of origins and patterns, and we see a lot of them in Genesis 4. We see that the righteous are persecuted by those who are religious but unrepentant. Again, we don't know why specifically Cain's offering was rejected, but the point is it was. And instead of going to God and trying to make it right and figure out what did I do wrong, what do I need to change, he became jealous and he committed murder. The pattern reached its nadir in Jesus' confrontation with the Pharisees, of course, who murdered him. Another thing we see is God allows the righteous and the wicked to thrive together. And as I said, this becomes something which the righteous struggle with. They struggle with it in Psalms. They struggle with it in Job. And in Job, we finally get to where God gives his great speech to Job, in which he doesn't answer all the questions, but he does tell Job a lot about how he manages the world and what he is doing. But the fact is, we do not see yet all things under Jesus' feet. We still see wickedness thriving. This continues until the angels will finally gather and separate the wheat and the weeds. Cities are places of moral degeneration, blasphemy, and violence, but also of great achievements. This pattern continues all the way to Babylon the Great Harlot. What is Babylon the Great Harlot in the book of Revelation? She is the ultimate portrayal of the ideal of the city. Wealthy, full of luxuries, a place of commerce, a place where people gather together, but also a place of great decadence and a place where ultimately the church is persecuted and hated. But the ideal of the city is finally redeemed in the choice of Zion, the city of God, and in the revelation of the New Jerusalem. So we saw in the book how from the very beginning, there are things that are wonderful about cities, just as there are things that are terrible about cities. But ultimately, the ideal of the city is redeemed in the New Jerusalem, just as the wicked ideal of Babylon, the great harlot, is finally destroyed. So that, in my understanding, is Genesis 4. And again, my point to you is when you're reading the Bible, focus on what it talks about. Don't focus on what it doesn't talk about. And then try to see how the themes that are in the passage you are looking at, how those themes pick up on prior passages in the Bible and how they are developed elsewhere in the Bible. So, did I go long? No, I didn't. I finished on time. It's a miracle. So thank you for showing up, and I hope to see you tomorrow.